Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Greetings, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. Jackie's here, I'm here, and believe me, we reach across the miles when we come to you because she lives in the West and I live in the Midwest, and you know our guests come from all over, and that's what is so fun about learning the stories of the 1950s, whether those stories come from individual people or whether they are the facts and figures of the times of the 1950s and what led up to those times and beyond those times. Jackie, what's happening today on our program? This is number 116. 115.
115. Okay, thank you. So before we start, I always like to remind our viewers to check out www.wildthewindmillwatch.com, that little banner that's running across the bottom. There you'll find all sorts of information about the authors of the book, While the Windmill Watched, A Slice of Rural America in the 1950s, which happens to be up there in the corner. You'll find the vendors, the events in which we take place, and then the 1950s Fun Chat all the way back through. This is number, she said, 116.
115.
15. Next time it'll be 16. Yes. Okay. So up in the corner, you'll see the book and the beautiful North Dakota sunset that wraps around it, as well as that little white dot, which indicates a very special event that happened. The book was published in April of 2021. And in April of 2022, the book was given the National Independent Press Award in regional nonfiction category as the distinguished favorite. So on with the show, as someone used to say in the 50s. I'm going to introduce you to a gal from North Dakota. Her name is Jan Dodge, a lifelong member of the Keene and Watford City communities of North Dakota, who she currently lives on her family farm and ranch east of Watford City. She and her husband own and operate a grain farm and cattle ranch, and she is the third generation on that farm. She enjoys spending her off time, such as it is, reading, cooking, flower gardening, the outdoors, and travel. Jan and her husband Cameron have 2 married daughters and 5 grandchildren. Jan is a retired director of 18 years of the Pioneer Museum of McKenzie County, which is located on the Long X Trading Post Visitor Center in Watford City, and she's also retired from the McKenzie County Tourism Director. So currently, she manages the Pioneer Gift Shop and Books and Long X Visitor Center. Doesn't sound too retired, though, does it, folks? Jan attended the Johnson Corner County School, Watford City High School, and Williston State College. She's a founding board member of the Long X Art Foundation and serves on numerous nonprofit boards. So, Jan, we welcome you to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So our chat today is going to begin long before the 1950s with learning of cattle trails and of open range in the mid-1800s, of homesteading in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the development of the oil industry, which actually began in the 1950s, and how they all influenced what the rural west of North Dakota is today. So, Jan, please begin our history lesson of the rural west in the mid-1880s.
Well, you mentioned numerous times about the Long X Center, Long X Art Foundation, and we do a lot of focus on the Long X Trail, the Long X Ranch. The Long X Ranch was established in 1884 by the Reynolds family, and it happened in that probably mid-1800s when the Civil War was officially over. And there's a lot of the cowboys and the fellas that were in the Civil War that headed back home to Texas. they discovered that cattle industry had kind of got away from everybody simply because there wasn't a lot of attending to it at the time. So they also had heard about the grasslands in the upper Midwest. Thought that might be something where they could gather these cattle easily, and I'm not sure easily, but they gathered cattle to move to the north. There was sounded like there was a lucrative market for that because of the forts that were being established out there, and one of the big things was the railroad that was moving west, so that it would be an easy transport of the East Coast, basically. So yeah, so it must have been a terribly interesting time in the lives of those people that moved literally thousands of head of cattle, Texas north.
Jan, where does the name Long X come from? That is what was so interesting to me when
right. So the Reynolds brothers, actually, they had a ranch on the Brazos River in Texas, which is about as far south as you can get, I believe. And they adopted the brand. The cattle brand was an X, and they called it the Long X. So on these Longhorn cattle that they brought north, they were all branded with the X, and they brought them up to an area in McKenzie County that is just south of Watford City. The original ranch of the Reynolds brothers was south of Watford City, about 16 miles on the McKenzie County side of the Little Missouri River. That's where they established their ranch headquarters. They also had brought about each drive probably around 3,000 head, from what I've read, of horses as well. And they were actually in a bit of a different location on the eastern edge of our county. So it was open range. I mean, it was not only the Reynolds brothers, but many others as well. And it's, go ahead.
So the purpose of bringing up that many horses up into northwest North Dakota, because before I finish my question, how far south of the Canadian border are you, so that our viewers can get a better?
I would say that we are. Let's see, about 2 hours, so 100 odd miles to the Canadian border.
So when they brought these horses up from southern Texas, was the idea to populate the horse industry in the Dakotas, in northwestern North Dakota, or were they used for these horses? Were they broke to ride, or what was
probably they were not broke to ride. They probably got broke to ride on the way up.
Oh, okay.
Because I mean, if you think about managing 3,000 head of cattle, or 2,500, or whatever was on the cattle drive. If you think about trying to manage that many cattle, it would take a tremendous amount of people and animals. It took 4 months to drive. From what I've read, it took at least 4 months to take these cattle from basically Mexico to upper Midwest, and even into Canada as well. So it was quite a feat. I mean, you movies have been made and books have been written about sort of an assumed romantic period of time, but the actual feat of it, I do not believe was that romantic.
Yes. And think of the chuck wagon.
Correct.
I mean, these riders had to have grub. How do they carried it that much from one end of the trail to the other?
And I think they had different points of rendezvous. Texas, there's a space called Doan's Crossing, up to Kansas. A lot of the cattle went to Kansas and were live loaded to the east
Sure.
on the trains.
Mhm.
And then they kind of broke into going further north, the grasslands up in this area,
Mhm.
was very enticing as well. And then, of course, the railroad came across the Dakotas at that time too. So all interesting. I mean, it's just so the trails actually became a bit of a network of trails. So the Long X Trail was probably part of the Great Western Trail or the Chisholm Trail, uh, where they were, it wasn't just the Reynolds brothers bringing cows to the Reynolds Ranch, but became numerous ranches, especially on the Little Missouri River. Diamond Sea Ranch is a rather famous ranch down in the Killdeer area that maybe you've heard of. And yeah, it's so we kind of like to think about that as some of the very first economic development, non-native economic development in this area.
Mhm.
Homesteading came in the real late 1800s, early 1900s to this area, which actually is a bit late compared to a lot of the other areas in the United States. It actually afforded that open range concept of cattle grazing for quite a few years to be very established in what they were doing. But in those first years, it was Longhorn cattle. Longhorn cattle are used to living in Texas. So that probably was some of their downfall, was the winters that they were trying to um, have up here with these cows. So that probably was their downfall,
Mhm.
not being able to survive. And then that led into other actual breeds of cattle that could uh, live in the area, and still very established ranches today. And some of the people on these ranches up here have roots to the people in Texas as well. So those generations have happened and they stayed. So it is an interesting story, you know.
So what about your family, since this is the third generation on your property?
Sure. On my family's side, of course, they were homesteaders. They were farmers mostly, and they came from the east. They came from Pennsylvania. My husband's family originated. His grandfather actually was one of the very first ranches in this county as well, the Dodge family, and they the grandfather actually came, he was a Civil War veteran, and her great grandfather was a Civil War veteran. And he came out of Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. But they heard of the ranches and the cowboys needed with the Dodge people, and open range and the beginnings of establishing a homestead. So they were able to, he was able to establish a homestead, the Dodge family, and have run cattle and be part of those generations of people that did that. So
how did people who came out of the east adapt to ranching in Northwest North Dakota?
well, like I say, my family in Pennsylvania is where they came from. They were farmers actually, and but they used horses for their machinery, basically, for turning the soil and for hay crops and that type of thing. But one thing that always makes me smile about those great grandparent people, they planted trees.
Well, was that part
No-
of the
No
homesteading?
no trees out here. And coming from the east, I think that must have been a hard thing. So we kind of call my great uncle a Johnny Appleseed because he planted a lot of trees on this place where I live. So
Was that part of the home of acquiring a homestead, was to plant a certain number of trees?
no, it was just living, the Homestead Act was just living on it for 5 years and making improvements. Making improvements basically was putting a tar paper shack up,
Mhm. They must have brought trees with them because there were no trees out there.
They did. I'm sure they did. Yep. Yes, that's correct.
Mhm.
And in my growing up years with them, because they were on this place, my great uncles were on this place, growing up with them every single year. And of course, that would be back in your 1950s, 50s, 60s. Um, I can remember that they ordered out of the old Gurney's catalog tree roots every
Yeah.
single year, and we had a mud bucket of trees that I helped plant, and whoever was available was putting trees in the ground. So
That's cool. I can remember getting the Gurney's catalog too.
yeah, right.
and sorting through it.
Yeah. Do you happen to have any stories or old letters or something or other about the settling, about homesteading, the hardships and the joys?
Well, they're because they did come from the east, and I'm speaking of my family, of course. There was a lot of letters sent back and forth, and it always amazes me when I come across, because the letter's still in the envelope, which was saved, and all it would say was Ben Homer Risser, Keene, North Dakota. That's all it said. How did that letter find them?
There weren't that many people out there.
Oh. Well, it's just the complication of getting it here. And when they came on the train, and they worked on the thrashing crews, which that's how a lot of them did, from my understanding. There would be these young men that would come out. They'd hear about, the excitement of it, I suppose, in a sense, and they'd come out and they'd work on these thrashing crews and earn enough money to buy a couple of horses and cross over the river and stake their claim. So, and the same, and that's, that I speak of my, that would be my father's family, my mother's family, directly from Norway. Same thing.
Wow.
Same thing. So I'm on, like, say, my father's side, I'm like 9th generation here in this country, and my mother's side, I'm 2nd generation.
Oh my goodness. Do you recall anything that your grandmother might have said about making the trip to the United States and even coming to the vastness of North Dakota?
Right. More so with my grandfather. My grandmother passed when I was very young. So I don't have a lot of recollection of my grandmother other than what my mom can tell me. But interestingly, with my grandfather, when he came, he staked a claim, started to work on it to prove it up. World War I breaks out. So he goes back to Europe as a soldier for the United States, serves his time. When he comes back, claim jumper took his claim that he started. So he ended up having to purchase a quarter of land to get established. So it's kind of an interesting little story. But my mother's, it was very close then to where my mother's family was, and so
evidently there was no repercussion for those naughty claim jumpers.
correct. From what I understand. I mean, that's the story that was always given, that they felt everybody felt bad, but he still
That's the way it was.
that's the way it was. Yeah.
And
But
evidently no one took the law into their own hands.
No,
not that time.
not that time.
So do you happen to know where the claims had been registered? Like, was there a United States registration office somewhere near there? Or do you know?
Yes. So, I talked about the cattle ranches, and a lot of those coming up from the south. That was along the Little Missouri River to the south of where we currently live. Where these people came out on the train was actually the northern tier of North Dakota. So they came through the small towns of Ray, North Dakota. So they would get off the train at Ray, work in those fields up there as hired help to make enough money. They would ferry across the river just on the northern edge of McKenzie County. So we have almost in our county, we have rivers almost all the way around. McKenzie County got to be known as the Island Empire. But these boys would come across on a ferry on the northern side of McKenzie County.
So because Ray was on the railroad, was that the land office?
Correct.
Office? Okay.
Yep.
Jan, take us back again to the Long X.
Yes.
Are there markers along the trail route?
Yes. And I did a little bit of research on that too. And some of that actually started quite long ago in Texas. Some of the probably descendants of those people that were on the cattle trails thought it was important to remember that history. And so they started to establish some markers of the Great Western Trail in probably the 1930s. So it has probably been dropped and picked up many times. There is now a Great Western Trail Association that has been established by some wonderful people. And the goals are to set markers basically all the way from Mexico, the Texas border towns, all the way to Canada. I know that South Dakota has established a lot of those markers have been established from Texas up into Kansas. I know that South Dakota is established, and North Dakota has just recently been established about a year ago with the help of Daryl Dorgan. So we have it's kind of a white concrete post that follows Highway 85. Highway 85 actually runs all the way from the Canadian border to the Mexico border. Wow. So that highway and the trail markers that kind of, I would say, commemorate that economic development that happened in those periods of time of the kind of the birth of the area. So so it's interesting, and every so far they have actually an granite information plaque, of which we have that also at the Long X Visitor Center as well.
Okay. So Jan, surely the trail didn't follow where a highway is.
Very closely.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
But like I say, it's a network. When they look at some of the proven history, it was quite a network. Did they all walk on the same path? No. But it was right up through the central area of these Midwest states, Texas, and through the pretty much the western parts of, Kansas and eastern Colorado, and I think it's like 8 states that they consider Great Western Trail passed through.
Do you have any knowledge if there were any stolen cattle along the way? Was that a concern?
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I try to think about that and read about it and whatnot. And, they pass through some volatile areas, whether it's uprisings or wolves or people stealing cattle because they want to take a herd to the train station. There wasn't a lot of proof of who owned it because they were pretty much feral Longhorn cattle that they'd go round up and move north.
But those that had the X brand on it would have been protected, or not even so, because who was the law back then, and brand inspecting that type of thing.
Right. So like I say, there's a lot of romantic books, romantic movies. If you've ever watched Lonesome Dove,
That's it.
I mean, it just kind of can make allow your mind to wander a little bit on the stories of it. But I would guess in reality it was a pretty tough road to go.
Take us into the 1950s, from that point where the cattle drives occurred coming up to the Watford City area. How did that affect the Watford City area, especially in the 1950s as time moved on from those cattle drives?
It established ranches. They more than likely, a lot of those ranches then did actually prove up homesteading claims. I know that of numerous, ranches that were established, and so they were able to continue on with what they were doing, I suppose. 1950s, like I say, it was it was the ranches that had been established. A lot of them, the descendants of those ranches in the 1950s. That's maybe where the road I would go down, because they were there for generations. I mean, it's just even my husband's family. We no longer are on their original property, but their family's still here, and there's numerous generations of that family that still ranch. So they had to have established a homestead of sorts.
Did the offspring of a lot of those ranchers move away from the ranching environment into another part of the United States?
Oh, I'm sure they saw during during World War II. Okay. There was a lot of there was a lot of the young men that went off to war and left the women to either manage the place or not. And if they couldn't, from our particular area, we saw a lot of people move to the West Coast, Jackie.
That's right. California, the Golden State.
Yep. California or state of Washington, out to the manufacturing.
To Boeing.
Boeing, yes.
Yep. Okay, so we've talked about the West cattle, and bring us up to date on the oil industry there. Now, we know now that Watford City and the Western North Dakota have been in the news a lot, the fracking, the Bakken, etc. But that's not the first oil boom in North Dakota. So tell us about that.
Correct. So in all actuality, the oil industry began in earnest in the 1950s, 1952, 1953. The first producing oil well in North Dakota happened up by Tioga, North Dakota, the Iverson well. It is still producing today. The second producing well in North Dakota happened here in our county, McKenzie County. And that was the Risser well #1. And that happened, that well is actually plugged, abandoned, and reclaimed at this point. But it happened in 1952, 53 when they started doing that drill. Oil industry happened again in the 1980s. 52 and the 80s were predominantly downhole drilling. So it was a real seismograph process in, I'm going to say, guessing a little bit where to put that drill. Now, in the time we are now, of course, it's more of this fracking process, more of almost a grid system where they will follow basically a suction line and go down that line and drill X number of holes. They're way more efficient in that on one site they can do a drill for 3, 4, 5, 6 holes basically, and do the extraction in that process. So the footprint is a lot smaller than what it had been in those days. But interestingly, that first well here in this county, when we would go back and do some reading in the newspapers and whatnot, the concerns that they had was what this was going to do to our roads and the big equipment that they were using to haul these things and haul the oil and haul the machinery and whatnot. You can imagine in the 1950s the size of farming equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And then the trucks and the drilling equipment and the rigs and all that, what it was happening. What's that going to do to our property? What's that doing to our roads and so on? 2000, it's the same concerns.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's the economic development side of it. So I'm always, being a farmer and rancher myself, I'm always like to say that farming and ranching is the anchor of this community. It always will be. It'll always be here.
Mm-hmm.
The generations of people that have continued on with farming and ranching. The oil industry is also a very integral part of our community as far as that development.
Mm-hmm. Having been to Watford City on our book tour just recently, it was a delight to come to Watford and see all of the economic development in your city. Can you talk a little bit about some of that?
Sure. I'm going to compare a little bit first between the 1980s and now. The 80s, we saw a very large influx of people, more of a transient group of people that came in and did the drilling and left. The price of oil dropped out in the 80s, and all of a sudden, those people were gone. And so that partly was the Watford City did a bit of a study to find out, where do we want to go from here? Do we want to, a lot of folks left. So one of the things that they really expanded upon was tourism to the area, mainly because of what we had to offer with the Badlands and the Theodore Roosevelt National Park to the north. Consequently, again, the Long X Visitor Center, a point of beginning for a lot of that expansion and being able to tell our story to people that naturally flowed through. So that was kind of that part of time for us. Enter now where we're at now, a different kind of drilling and a different kind of extraction with the oil and gas. There's, from what I've been told, there's a lot of gas product there. And so consequently, that has developed into expansion of gas processing plants. That takes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week of employment. That has brought in close to 10,000 people to our community.
My. In how short of time then?
A very short amount of time. So I'm thankful to the wonderful planners that we had in our community in how they've been able to expand. A goal has been quality of life for the people that move there. A lot of times at the visitor center, we will hear, my husband's coming here to work and he's been here for 3 years. I've decided now to try it. And now I'm not ever leaving. It's my last move. So I feel we're successful. You know, I mean, there's a lot of people very happy with the move to Watford City.
That gave me chills when you said that.
I had at the visitor center, I had an interesting board up. It was like a timeline board that talked about when the first people came as ranchers and ticked all the way through current. And then I invited people to write notes, you know, where are you from? Why did you come? And I had so many of those, and it was just a sticky note, put it up on the board. And some of them literally brought tears to my eyes because they're like, we came here for a better way of life. So no different than
100 years ago.
100 years, yeah, no different. Absolutely no different than those 1800s when those cowboys were coming, because it was for a better way of life. The homesteaders for a better way of life.
Yes.
So it's interesting. So the industry has, in that light, I say that I'm thankful for the planners in our community and what they've done for our community to direct things in as positive a way as possible. You know, and the building that you guys witnessed, the buildings, the schools. I mean, we've expanded our schools threefold. We've had students from every single state in the United States and something like 23 different countries have ended up in this area. So it's been an interesting process, and I will say it has allowed one of my daughters and their family to move back here. She teaches school. He is now employed with us on the farm ranch. So we're moving into that fourth and fifth generation on the family ranch.
How wonderful.
What a history.
Well, viewers, we have been visiting with Jan Dodge from Watford City, North Dakota, a wealth of historical information that you have just only tiny bit witnessed is what she knows about the growth of the Long X cattle trail beginning close to Mexico in the United States in the late 1800s and coming up to Northwest North Dakota, up to the Watford City area, and the expansion of that and the effect of that, not only on Northwest North Dakota, but really on the entire state and the entire nation. So Jan, we thank you so much for sharing this story with us. Actually, it's multiple stories. We're so grateful. Thank you very much.
Really, thank you.
Thank you.
Jackie, how can you close our show today?
Well, I just always like to have the viewers pay attention to two colors on the screen. Right below the screen, you'll see a red subscribe button and a blue thumbs up button. So please touch those and join us next time. Tell your friends and your family about the 1950s Fun Chat.
Yes.
Till then, toodaloo.
Bye-bye.